Okay, I'm going to address you as my fellow students, because you never stop being a student. You're dead when you stop being a student. Always remember that. Okay? Now, about 68 years ago, this coming January 2nd, a large ship left New York, filled with hundreds of young teenagers. They were mostly 18 and 19, to sail to the Philippines. And it took them 2 months to get there. They didn't arrive till 1941 March, 2 whole months. Today they're there in hours. But it was totally untrained, believe it or not, with inadequate materials to fight with, and no knowledge of actually what they were getting into. The world was at war, but the United States was not involved until the Japanese struck in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. That anniversary comes December 7th, the day that will live in infamy, according to our former president of the time, Franklin Roosevelt. Germany had been rampaging in Europe for 2 years, murdering, slaughtering, destroying everything in its path to conquer the lands to the east. Japan had been rampaging for 10 years. They started in the place called Korea, and I hope you all know where it's located. It's on the map. They next invaded China. They murdered tens of millions of Chinese and Koreans and imprisoned huge numbers. Meanwhile, the United States of America was totally asleep. Our leaders in Washington had let us down because they weren't aware what was going on in the world. They weren't paying attention when they were in junior high school and high school. And that is why it's so darn important that you do pay attention, because you are our future leaders. And it is not going to be very long before you're put in these positions of responsibility and your entire country is depending on you. And you dare not make the wrong decision. Believe me, it's going to happen, because standing before you is a person who was 14 a short time ago. It goes by very fast, and all of a sudden you've lost it. You say, what was I doing? I was pushing the buttons on my cell phone or staring at stupid TV shows. I wasn't reading. I don't know where I am in the world. I have no idea what happened before me in my country. So how the devil can I assume responsibility to run this country? And it's going to be your responsibility. Now, when the Japanese turned on the United States and attacked in Hawaii, they destroyed the naval ships and the aircraft, but they made the error of not destroying our naval base. If they had, it would have been 5 years longer that we would have been at war, at least. And they may have won. So you better study all the languages you can, because you never know which language you may be speaking if we fall asleep again. Now, a few hours after the strike at the U.S. in the Hawaiian Islands, they struck in the Philippines. There, they had learned their lesson, and they destroyed all our facilities, the naval bases, the airfields, all the supply equipment, the hangars, everything was gone. We were left with personnel who were totally untrained to fight on the ground, and suddenly we all became infantry. We were pulled into a piece of land across the bay, if you know your geography, from Manila, the capital of the Philippines, to a peninsula which sticks out into the bay called Bataan. There we started the first battle Christmas Day of 1941. The battle lasted for 4 months. We had no food. Our ration was starvation level. By the time we were surrendered by our country, and we did not surrender individually, we had been starved down almost 45%. We were walking skeletons, riddled with disease, burning up with fever, dysentery, horrible diseases. The enemy won in that encounter because of disease and starvation. That's what licked us. The general in charge said after the surrender, remember, you did not surrender. I surrendered you. Shortly after the surrender of that force on the Bataan Peninsula, the last forces were on the island in the middle of the bay called Corregidor, named after an ancient Spanish fort. That was surrendered 1 month later, May of 1942. That was the end. Now we became slaves of the Japanese, totally at their mercy, and they showed no mercy. They packed thousands into a tiny area on the island of Corregidor, approximately 12,000 Filipinos and Americans, no food, no water, in blazing sun averaging about 120 degrees on concrete with no sanitation facilities. So I'll let you visualize what it became after 3 weeks. We were then hauled in and forced over the side and water up to our neck to be marched through the streets of Manila, the capital, to show the Filipino people how the white man had been conquered. He had been taught a lesson in the Far East by the Imperial Japanese forces. And they weren't called Japanese then, they were called Nipponese. That was the Dai Nippon was the name of the country, Nippon. We were enslaved there, building military facilities under clubs which would come down on your back or anywhere else in your body. This is simulated, but if you can visualize this coming down on you constantly all day to force you to work faster. We called them vitamin sticks because it took the place of vitamins and food. And if you didn't jump and didn't respond, the bayonet would be stuck into you. Countless thousands died in those first few months in the Philippines. In one prison camp alone, 26,000 died in 6 weeks. In another, 3,000 died. Over 100 West Point graduates, the largest number in history to die at any one spot. They were all murdered. Then the corporations in Japan demanded that the military transport us to the home islands of Japan to work as slaves for these corporations. We were packed into the holds of ships. If you've ever seen the photos of the African slaves brought under those horrible conditions to be enslaved in the United States and in the Caribbean islands, you can visualize what it was like, because it was exactly the same, only ours were in so-called modern ships, and we were packed deep down in the holds with the hatches closed. You couldn't stand. This was the position you had to stay for, sometimes for up to 2 months. you were forced to be in, packed in shoulder to shoulder on wooden platforms in the bottom of the ships. They would drop a bucket of wormy food down for everybody and another container of water once a day, and it was fought over. Some people never got anything. Horrible disease was flourishing in the holds. Men went mad from encephalitis. That's caused by, here, still, you have a chance of getting it from the bite of an insect. Brain fever. They would go out of their minds and sink their teeth into their fellow men to suck their blood. And you had to beat them to death to break the hold of their jaws. 6,000 went to the bottom in those ships sunk by American submarines and aircraft because they weren't marked the way they were supposed to be. Again, it was deliberate murder. And of those who survived to get to Japan, the condition of the body was barely living. Then we were forced to do the most brutal manual labor, deep in mines and in factories. Some of the mines went down 5,000 feet and under the sea. And believe me, the tunnels were created for peoples 100 years before. They were barely high enough to bend over well down to crawl through, to dig the coal and the copper and the other minerals. And some of the mines had been abandoned for 50 or more years, but they had cheap labor, so they opened them up. They desperately needed the materials, and we were the labor. Finally, the United States prevailed. The Japanese gave up. The emperor spoke, and I'll never forget the day we were given the day off deep in the mountains, northern Honshu, north of Tokyo, near where the Olympics were held at Nagano, was the copper mine where I was. And the radio in the camp, in the commander's office, was blaring the emperor's speech, the first time the people had ever heard him speak. And he did not say we've surrendered. He said the war is not going well, so we better stop for a while. And that was about it. That was the surrender. But for 3 weeks or more, the Americans were still prisoners in the camps until they were brought out, either by train, and they didn't see an American in some cases. In our camp, we didn't see an American until September 4th, and the surrender took place August 14th. Today, approximately about 250 are alive out of 35,000. So that can give you some idea. Almost 50% were murdered during their POWship. And a large number died the first year when they got home from the effects, approximately 25% more. Now I'd like to hear some questions. So we'll all be learning together. Who has a question? You've seen the photographs. There's one. Hi.
What force were you? Like the Air Force, Marine?
Me personally?
Yeah.
When I enlisted in Hartford, Connecticut, October 7th, 1940. That's a long time ago. Wow. I enlisted what I thought was a safe branch. The U.S. Air Corps was part of the Army then, wasn't separate. As soon as the Japanese struck in the Philippines, there was no more Air Corps. We lost all our aircraft, and we became infantry. And we had never had a day's training. And we were issued World War I rifles. That's the equipment we had. It was so bad that the cots for the hospital were rotted. The instruments for work operating on us were rusted. The ammunition was so old, most of it wouldn't go off. It was corroded. 1 out of 10 hand grenades possibly would go off. We had totally, here's another question.
Dan, we have one.
Okay.
We have less than a
1
minute,
minute.
folks. We have less than a minute.
Okay, here we go.
Next
Next question.
comes.
Do you know anyone who's still alive from the war?
From our group, less
Hold
than
on, hold on,
300.
don't go anywhere. Wait one
Hi,
moment.
would you turn in all those photos to the next group?
Okay, hold on,
Everything.
purple team, sit down, we're not going anywhere.
Wow.
Before we leave, two things. One, I would like you to thank Mr. Crowley for coming in today, and two, thank you for his service.